Okay, so today we're going to learn about that time a brutal religious cult took over Europe. Now, quick, what is your worst nightmare? If you didn't answer the Inquisition, you answered wrong. You got the torture chambers, you got the cruel clergy, and when they burned you at the stake, if they burned you at the stake, the whole town came to watch, including your friends and family. I can only think of one greater horror than being subject to the Inquisition, and that's being subject to just about any other court at that time. Yeah, people back then were generally terrible, and that doesn't absolve the Inquisition. That just condemns everybody else. So we have this idea of the Inquisition as the ultimate evil, and it was. But a lot of that is because the Inquisition taught others how to be evil more efficiently. Great. Even now, we describe weaponized courts as an inquisition, and the Catholic Church doesn't necessarily have anything to do with it. It's the people who are the problem and the techniques that the Inquisition taught others, shared. It's me. Hey, I'm the problem. It's me. Yeah, humans, that's you. Now, the Inquisition was pure horror for many reasons. You've got the torture and the public executions, of course. But worse than that, if you were accused, there was nobody to come and help you. Your neighbors could have been the ones that turned you over, so they were suspect. The police weren't coming to help you. They were acting on behalf of the inquisitors. You're basically on your own. And all of the mechanisms of the town and of the courts were turned against you. There was nobody coming to help. Now, the Inquisition is kind of a myth to us now, but for 600 years in Europe and around the world, it was very, very real. The Inquisition of popular culture and the real Inquisition aren't necessarily the same things, but the stories didn't come from nowhere. You know, they're based on something. Now, the information in this video comes from two books. We've got Inquisition by Edward Peters, and then we've got God's Jury, The Inquisition and the Making of the Modern World by Cullen Murphy. Plus, I'll refer some popular movies like The Pope's Exorcist and The Name of the Robes. Now, The Pope's Exorcist, that is currently on Netflix. It's mid as a movie, but you know I like a good possession flick, even if it's bad. It's entertaining at least. So yes, I paid to see it in the theater, and yes, I would do it again. It stars Russell Crowe as a chief exorcist, and I won't ruin it for you, but it kind of dives into how the demons worked through the Inquisition to bring horror to the mortal world. So what's scarier? Supernatural evil working through man to hurt others, or that same amount of evil just coming from regular folks? I'll let you ponder that one. Okay, first, let's get some things clear and get them out of the way. There was not just a single Inquisition. What we mainly think of as the Inquisition is the Spanish Inquisition, but there were multiple versions. The Inquisition was a department in the Catholic Church whose job it was to fight heresy, aka wrongthink. So they assigned inquisitors, kind of like prosecutors and judges, to go after suspects for thought crimes, like heresy, blasphemy, later witchcraft. And their job was to be inquisitive, to look at things, to ask questions, and to get answers. Now look at our language now. An inquiry is just fine, but an inquisition is trouble. They turned a regular noun into a proper noun. That is how bad the Inquisition was. Now, remember we did that video on the Cathars, these Christian Gnostics in the south of France in the 12th century and 13th century? So that's how the Inquisition started, by going after those heretics. Now, remember, the Pope even called a crusade against the Cathars. So check that video out. I really don't want to repeat myself too much. I will link it at the bottom. This video is a follow-up to that, and I know I'm a little late. I'm a little late, but once I got started into my Inquisition research, I had to decide whether to bring you this single video or to dedicate my entire YouTube to the Inquisition, because there's just that much information. Finally, I said, I'm just going to put this video out and move on, because the Inquisition is not going to take over my life. And yes, it has happened that some obscure historical bit of trivia has taken over people's lives. They are called PhDs. Anyway, the Inquisition sometimes gets a bad name for cruelty, but it often dealt with heretics in a more dignified way than the secular authorities or the lynch mobs. So the Inquisition, better than a lynch mob, huh? They should put that on merch. Better than a lynch mob. At least you get a t-shirt, right? Anyway, for a while, the Pope would assign a specific set of inquisitors to follow up on specific instances of heresy. Now, we saw that in The Name of the Rose with Sean Connery and Christian Slater. If you didn't see that movie, it's set in a medieval monastery where a lot of people die for the crime of wrongthink. And also, Ron Perlman goes full retard. Never go full retard. But it's still worth a watch. The villain in that film is a man by the name of Bernard Gui. He's a famous inquisitor. Gui? Bernard Gui was a real person. He was so bad that he has become an asshole of legend. Do you know how much of an asshole you have to be to still be a villain in a movie 600 years later? 600 years after your death, you're still the asshole. Second to none. Now, Gui wrote a manual on how to go after heretics. This is the most interesting thing about the Inquisition because it had how-tos on how to interrogate and torture people. Now, to us, that seems really macabre, but these manuals were the early handbooks of psychology. They pried into people's minds to see if they were guilty of holding the wrong ideas, of holding ideas against the church, and of sin. Now, the inquisitors had to get into people's minds and write their blasphemous thoughts because the inquisitors wanted to save these people's souls. The stakes for them were greater than life and death. The stakes were heaven and hell. Yeah, that's scary. So the goal of the inquisitor was to get a confession. They needed the defendants. They needed the defendants to be sorry, to acknowledge their sin and repent. So they played these mind games supplemented with torture. See, people think that horror looks like torture. It looks like a torture chamber. In reality, horror is a psychiatrist's office. So in the Inquisition, it was a little bit of both. Now, for some of you, true horror is family court. We won't go into that here. No. The one thing that was consistent in Inquisitions is that when they came to your town, they went looking for crimes. They gave the town this thing called the Edict of Grace, and everyone had 2 weeks to come to the Inquisitors and confess their sin. If you did that, they said they would let you off. But then you'd have to name other sinners. Now, often, if no one came forward, the Inquisitors would have nothing on that town. But people got so scared that they did come forward. So, and also, unfortunately, some people went to the Inquisitors to snitch on their neighbors or an enemy. It really be your own people, don't it? It really be your own. But later, this Edict of Grace, where you have this 2-week period, it became the Edict of Faith. And people had 2 weeks to come and denounce all heretics. So if you knew someone else was guilty of wrongthink and you kept quiet, you too were guilty. Scary. And that's how tightly they controlled people's thoughts and their words. So what have we learned? Keep your mouth shut. Anyone asking you for a confession doesn't have your best interest in mind. Get a lawyer. Immediately get a lawyer. Also, people could accuse you anonymously. Right now, we have the right to face our accuser. That's why that's that important. Now, the most famous phase of the Inquisition was the Spanish Inquisition. Now, I'm not going to make this whole video about European history, but I'll sum it up as quickly as possible. A lot of things happened in 1492, not just Columbus sailing the ocean blue. Also, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, they ruled over Spain together, and they were strict Catholics. In that year, they drove the Muslims off the Iberian Peninsula. But also, they expelled the Jews. Now, before you pick on Spain, England had already expelled the Jews in 1290, and France had done so too in 1306. The Jews were forced to leave or convert. Now, if they left, they could go to Spain or later the New World in India. But if they stayed, they had to convert to Christianity. So later, Spain did the same thing, and they called these converts conversos. Now, here's what's interesting. The Inquisition couldn't go after anyone who wasn't a Christian, but they could go after fake Christian. They suspected that these former Jews were not believing Christians, that they were not devout Catholics. They called them crypto Jews or secret Jews. I prefer crypto Jews. I'm kind of mad cryptocurrency is over because I can't call any of my Jewish friends crypto Jews anymore. I'm kind of hoping that Bitcoin makes a comeback so I can use it. The truth is actually a lot less goofy. See, once a person converted to Christianity, they were subject to the Inquisition. Some conversos became functioning members of the community, and they actually helped out. They tried, but they were suspected of practicing Judaism in private or of actually being atheists. So really, Jewish people became persecuted because they were ethnically Jewish. It didn't matter what they professed to believe. Their blood wasn't pure. They weren't going to be accepted in the community. They just weren't going to. Now, others converted under the threat of exile, so they never considered themselves Christians. They practiced Judaism once they got the chance. Still, they were prosecuted for apostasy. And this is why the Inquisition kind of gets a bad rap for burning Jews at the stake. Technically, they burned former Jews at the stake, or crypto Jews. You may recognize this from History of the World.
The Inquisition, what a show, the Inquisition. Here we go, we know you're wishing that we go away.
The practicing Jews were actually exiled. Now, on the same token, you also had crypto Buddhists and you also had crypto Hindus. Who else had crypto? Anyone who converted to Christianity just because, hey, the Catholic Church is here and we're gonna go along. What is this monk saying? I don't know. They got cake. Anyone who did that, but then went back to their old faith, was then subject to the Inquisition. So you had crypto fill in the blank. They also had a little Inquisition in India too, which complicates things. Anyway, moving on. So I guess the lesson from all this, the lesson is don't do what anti-Semites say. There's nothing you can say or do to make them happy. If you give in to them, it just makes things worse. So these are the lessons from the Inquisition. Don't give an inch. Go into exile. It might be nice. Anyway, we get a lot of horror myths from the Spanish Inquisition because after the Protestant Reformation and during the religious wars of Europe, there was a lot of anti-Spanish sentiment. England, in particular, had a lot of, let's just say, they're called true crime novels, early true crime novels, where the Spanish Inquisition and the Spanish were the villains. Aren't the Spanish awful? Well, what is the Tower of London, England? What happened in Salem? Salem was an Inquisition, but it wasn't the Inquisition. So think of it like that. Now, there is another legendary asshole of the Spanish Inquisition, and his name is Thomas de Torquemada, who was the initial inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition, and he also wrote a manual. Very ambitious man. And yes, the Spanish Inquisition was actually very awful. I'm not trying to downplay it at all. They used to burn people at the stake during these public rituals called auto de fe or act of faith. And it was a ritual. It was actually a really interesting ritual. It was a public sentencing that would often end in public execution. The whole town came out. There would be prayers. There would be sermons. There had to be s'mores. At some point, someone brought s'mores. There probably wasn't s'mores. That I added. I added the s'mores part. But everyone would come to see the damned be burned. And I believe it was this book here that described it as human sacrifice, Christian human sacrifice, because they proved to their God that they were faithful by killing this person. Now, the Spanish Inquisition went after a lot of people, not just former Jews. They went after humanists. They went after alumbrados, aka the Illuminati, but not our Illuminati. They went after Protestants and sorcerers and blasphemers. Now, someone could accuse you of blasphemy, and then the Inquisition shows up at your door. So you better not have a lot of enemies. You'd be on the stake like, I got enemies, got a lot of enemies. And they're in the crowd watching you burn. So don't have a lot of enemies. Don't. Another iteration of the Inquisition was actually the Roman Inquisition. And of course, this happened in Italy. And they went after blasphemers too and non-believers. But what they're best known for is going after scientific heretics. So we get the persecution of Galileo and Bruno. We talked about Bruno in Death to Smarty Pants. Really sad what they did to him. They burned him at the stake. Spoiler alert, burned at the stake. Now, to control thought, the Inquisition came up with a list of banned books, the list of forbidden books, the Librorum Prohibitorum, and that lasted from 1559 to 1966. People within the Catholic world had to get permission to read certain books if they even could. And the church had to bully people because they had no longer controlled the flow of information. The printing press put an end to their monopoly on knowledge. Remember, they used to copy things by hand. The monks used to copy things by hand, but then printing press, everyone gets it. And also, the Inquisition morphed into witch trials. We went over this in the Crucible video. However, the Inquisition was often less cruel to suspected witches than secular authorities and townspeople. So those were your real toxic friends group. And this is why I have trust issues. I read history too much not to have trust issues because I guess you wanted to see the Inquisition rather than an angry mob outside your house if you were a suspected witch. I talk about my trust issues a lot. Definitely check out that Crucible video. Anyway, the Inquisition was the boogeyman of a superstitious Europe. Back when people thought that God's wrath would visit a town for harboring a non-believer, back when people believed that the Jews were poisoning the wells, when people believed that women danced with the devil and killed children, the Inquisition was what came to you in the night. Now, as people became smarter with the Enlightenment, the Inquisition kind of faded away. It really ended completely with Napoleon's conquest of Europe, but by then it was already a shadow of its former self. Now, I know what you're thinking. The Inquisition is terrible. I'm so glad it's dead and we don't have to deal with them. Well, yes and no. The office of the Inquisition is now known as the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, and it's still a department in the Vatican, and it goes after crimes in the clergy. So yes, that's right. The Inquisition is now the department that investigates pedos. Bet you never thought you'd be on the side of the Inquisition. But if you're not, you're on the side of pedos. So pick right. And we have a lot to thank the Inquisition for. It helped form the modern world as we know it, for better or worse. The Inquisition was the first single bureaucracy to spread across all of Europe. Prior to that, there were local prosecutions, and the Inquisition covered the continent, and then even farther out than that. They used the same manuals. They all spoke Latin, which is rare because at the time, most people spoke the vernacular, and they couldn't even understand the court proceedings, unfortunately. Now, Cullen says something really interesting. He basically points out that speaking Latin back then was like knowing how to code now. That's how helpful and rare it was. Now, also, which is very convenient, if you were convicted by the Inquisition, they took all your earthly goods. Even if you weren't convicted by the Inquisition, you had to pay them for your time in prison. Now, Peter says that the Inquisition barely broke even because it had to employ a lot of lay people, but it's easy to lose money on paper. You know, we all do our taxes. You mean to tell me that all those people working for the Inquisition didn't have a vested interest in keeping it going? Sorry, Peters, but I don't buy it. Now, of course, the Inquisition was a lot of paperwork. They had to keep track of the person who was accused and of all of their friends. This was kind of like an early friendship map, and we see it on social media a lot now. Everyone's connections. It's early IT, information technology. They could keep track of relationships of the defendants. Let's say the defendant is a converso. Now, what's really interesting is that later Nazis used early IBM technology to keep track of Jews and their relationships. So it's a bummer that the Jews were persecuted, but silver lining, we get better tech. So, Jewish people, I know things look really grim right now. It's October 2023. But think of the tech that this latest round of persecution could bring us. You're like, oh no, don't attack us again. But are you being selfish? Think of how much better your persecution could make the lives of Gentiles across the world. I'm kidding. I'm actually kidding. That's kind of messed up. I'm just noting comparisons. I'm actually kidding. But not about the part of all that information technology. You keep that in mind. Yeah, so maybe don't like your synagogue on Facebook. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. The rest of it is a joke. And yes, the Inquisition paved the way for modern bureaucracy and intelligence gathering. The same techniques have been used by so many secret police since, but also by social media companies. So we gave up all of our information and connections, and they didn't even have to pull out any of our fingernails. Not a single fingernail. Our torture is reading the terms of service, which we never do. Imagine this torture is like, you can have the Iron Maiden, or you can read this terms of service, which is like really, really, really long. It's like this long. What do you want? You're like, give me the Iron Maiden. Just give me the Iron Maiden. I don't want to read all that. So maybe the Inquisition sent us down a path of annoying paperwork and petty office tyrants. Every time you have to fill out a form that asks the same thing multiple times, the same information, it's really annoying. Think of the Inquisition. Maybe the real horror here is paperwork. So now that the Inquisition is history, it's good for spooky stories. And we can thank you, God, that we no longer have to live under the grasp of a brutal religion. And let's hope we never get back there. Thanks for watching. Subscribe.